criminal cases. I'm going to hide that there for a moment. And our presenter today is Dr. Marty Beyer. I'd first like to go through a few technical and housekeeping matters. First of all, if you haven't done so already, please download and print Dr. Beyer's one-page document, Developmental Framework, because she's going to be referring to it throughout today's presentation. I've emailed this to you, but you can also access it from this page in the box on the upper right. Click on the words Developmental Framework, and then you can click on Download Files, and then you can open it up on your computer. Second, today's class has been approved for 1 CLE credit from the Washington State Bar Association and 1 CJE credit from the Administrative Office of the Courts, if we have any judicial officers out there. If you're watching this live today on February 17th and you would like our office to report your credit hour, please download the document CLE CJE Attendance Report and just follow those instructions. If you are watching this webinar as a recording, please report your own CLE credit using the activity code that's found at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Also, we provided some helpful websites with more resources related to today's presentation. So in the box titled Websites, you can link to those. Now, we're going to keep this virtual classroom open for about an hour after the live presentation has ended, so that you'll have ample time to access these resources. Also, these are live and downloadable resources for anyone who is viewing the recording. Finally, here at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you'll see a box that's titled Questions, Comments. Throughout today's presentation, just go ahead and you can type in that box. Just remember, after you type something, remember to hit Enter. Otherwise, no one else will see it. Today, Dr. Beyer is going to address questions during the last 5 or so minutes of the hour, but she's also agreed to stick around longer if there are more questions, so you're all welcome to stay beyond that hour. Now, one thing we wanted to do today, since this is a webinar, is to get a feel for who's out here in our virtual live audience. So I've put out a few questions and let us know. What's your role in the juvenile justice system? How many years have you worked there? And also, where do you work? We have people coming here from a variety of locations. You can type your location in at the bottom of that Your Location pod. There should be a white box at the bottom where you can go ahead and type that in. And this gives us and Dr. Beyer an idea of who all is joining us today. Terrific. So it looks like we have a majority attorney audience here, a few probation officers and some others, which is great. A lot of experienced folks and some who are new. Good variety there. And quite a bit of geographic diversity. First of all, welcome to those of you outside of Washington who are joining us here today. We're thrilled that you can join us. I believe we might even have someone from Puerto Rico out there as well. But otherwise, we do have quite a bit of diversity here around the state of Washington as well. So again, thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to go ahead, hide some of these. Looks like we're done typing. Thank you, guys. So I'm very pleased today to introduce Dr. Marty Beyer. I'm sure many of you already know her. She is nationally known independent consultant on juvenile justice and child welfare issues. Dr. Beyer has a PhD in clinical psychology from Yale University and is joining us today from Portland, Oregon. So Dr. Beyer, I'm going to hand over the controls to you now.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction, and thank you so much for putting together this webinar, and welcome to everyone out there who is participating. We're going to be spending our time together working through this developmental framework. I designed this framework as a way of helping us figure out what is behind the behavior of each of the young people that we work with. And of course, when we think about how to apply this framework, we realize that each young person is going to have a different combination of these characteristics that can be used to help us understand how they came to be involved in their offense, and will also be very helpful in designing rehabilitative services. The framework, as we work through it, you'll see is organized around 3 areas that I've chosen for understanding adolescent development: immaturity, disabilities, and trauma. On the far left-hand side of the framework, you'll see the column that is titled Roper, Graham, and Miller. And in that column, I've included some brief quotes from some of the amici briefs prepared in Roper, Graham, and Miller by the American Psychiatric Association, American Psychological Association, and other professional groups. These briefs are the single best adolescent development textbook that I know of, because they weave together both the recent findings from MRI research about teen brains with the years of research about how kids think and make decisions. And just so that I can get you interested in reading those extremely helpful briefs, if you haven't, here are a couple examples of quotes from some of those briefs. First, this one that says, it is statistically aberrant to refrain from risk-taking in adolescence. Which of course applies to all adolescents and is the consensus of researchers around the country about teenagers. And then a second quote here: most adolescent delinquent behavior occurs on a social stage where immediate pressure of peers is the real motive. So what's been done in this compilation of research is not only to review important findings that we may all be aware of, such as peers being far more influential on teenagers in general than peers are on adults, but then to apply it to the population that we work with. So these are just a few quotes, but I think you will find those briefs very helpful. And of course, I don't do justice to them at all by simplifying them in this framework, but this gives you one whole page that will walk us through how we might think about each individual teenager. The rest of the developmental framework tracks horizontally. So I begin with immaturity, and then disabilities, and then trauma. And then from each of those, I move on to apply how they might have affected a young person's offense, although for each young person, it will be a different combination, as I said, how they might have influenced the young person during police questioning. And then we'll talk about how rehabilitative services can be thought through given the unique characteristics of the young person. So we will follow the framework across. Let's begin now with immaturity, which is the typical part of this chart. That is, if we went to any high school, we would find that teenagers have immature thinking, they have immature identity, and they are just progressing in developing their moral reasoning. All of these characteristics are normal for young people under 18, and we expect them. And so when we apply them to understanding the offense and designing rehabilitative services, we do so in the context of recognizing that these are characteristic of teenagers. They're not abnormalities. Most schools and extracurricular activities and even some workplaces that employ teenagers design the way they do things with immature thinking, immature identity, and immature moral reasoning in mind, because they're aware that these are characteristic of all kids, although in a different combination. So we might see a young person that has one aspect of immature thinking and not the rest of them. Or we might see a young person who is employed or is a talented athlete or is great at school and yet still has a mixture of the characteristics that we'll talk about under immature thinking, immature identity, and developing moral reasoning. So beginning with immature thinking, it is typical of teenagers not to be able to anticipate the consequences of their actions. This is a real limitation about the way that they think, and being able to see the worst thing that could happen is something that develops only gradually over the teenage years. So, of course, this is familiar to all parents and to other adults as well, that a teenager will often not prepare as much as they need to for an exam, and then will stay up half the night before the exam texting their friends, and then get to the exam not as well prepared as they'd like, and definitely with sleep deprivation. Most adults would comment, why didn't you recognize that not being well prepared and staying up all night was going to interfere with your grade, and that was an important exam. You should have been able to anticipate that. But in fact, many teenagers will repeatedly make poor decisions like that as if they don't really see ahead and are unable to talk themselves through the importance of decision-making that will put them in the best position to take their exam. Likewise, most teenagers have difficulty seeing choices that are available to them in any decision that they make. Where adults are able to use a pros and cons approach to decision-making and evaluate different choices that they see in order to use their best judgment. Teenagers often only see one choice, and therefore aren't able to weigh what makes one choice better and for what reasons than another. It is characteristic of teenagers not to correctly assess the riskiness of their behavior. Minimizing risk occurs with all teenagers, and it is something that only gradually becomes an ability that they have to say, this behavior, this action, these friends are too risky for me. So, as an example, a young person that I know whose favorite activity is to jump on a skateboard and hold on to the back of a moving vehicle. if we put aside who's driving the vehicle and whether they're supposed to be driving that vehicle, all of us, when I describe being on a skateboard behind a moving car, are already at the emergency room. We can't stop ourselves from seeing the riskiness of that behavior. And yet, for the teenager who jumps on the skateboard, they're not seeing that worst thing that could happen. And if their parent meets them at the emergency room and says, "What were you thinking?" If by thinking we mean seeing risk correctly and making a different choice, then the teenager wasn't thinking in the way an adult would. Immature thinking is operative in most of the offenses that teenagers commit. They will often describe their offenses as it just happened, and as the result of impulsive actions, which are typical of teenagers. For those who are arrested related to their social media use, including texting, they will say, well, it was just talk, and not see that there was any risk associated with sexting a picture of themselves to appear and then being surprised the next morning when the entire school has seen it. And this applies, too, to teenagers who report that they feel that they have to have a weapon to show in order to be able to stand up to the threats that they see every day on the street, but then say they had no plan to use that weapon. Moving on to police questioning, immature thinking is present there as well. Teenagers are usually very pressured to get through the questioning as quickly as possible to get home, and not seeing the importance of the questioning itself. And despite Miranda warnings, they don't envision their statement in court. Most young people that I interview in detention, if I pull out their written statement to ask them about it, will be very surprised and say, where did you get that? Demonstrating that they weren't able to look ahead to that statement appearing in court. Let's move on now to immature identity, also typical of teenagers. It takes years during adolescence to develop a stable, positive identity, which is based primarily for most teenagers on their successes. But most of the teenagers that we work with are young people who have not been successful. Most of them have long histories of school difficulties, and that has resulted in their not having access to success opportunities in athletics or in the arts. So they don't have a core of success to build their positive identity around. Furthermore, all teenagers want acceptance, and especially from peers, and teenagers who don't get acceptance from positive peers still need to belong and will gravitate toward anybody who accepts them. Lastly, teenagers, of course, want to progress toward independence, but they can't function independently and require much more adult supervision than they are often receiving. This immature identity affects offenses in a variety of ways, particularly for teenagers who react to being bullied because they don't have high self-esteem, and teenagers who, because of their desire to be accepted, are easily influenced by others. Furthermore, for the teenagers that we work with, often many of their parents work 2 jobs or have not provided adequate supervision, often for years, and as a result, offenses occur during school hours when the teenager should be in school or at night when they should be at home. Immature identity affects police questioning as well, particularly the young persons not being sure of themselves and being very self-conscious during the police questioning. And moving on to moral development, as we all know, teenagers can be very moral people. They are constantly asserting themselves when things appear unfair to them, unfair at home, unfair in school, and for those who are detained, the many unfair things they describe in detention. We often see that teenagers who have a religious upbringing or do know right from wrong, which most of them do, or because of being under so much stress at the time of the offense, were unable to use good moral reasoning, and then after the offense are in shock that they were involved in the offense. We often see a passing description of a teenager as lacking remorse. But in fact, assessing remorse about an offense is a very difficult thing to do, and especially soon after the arrest. It can take months before a teenager who believes that their offense was an accident for them to be able to understand how, even though they didn't mean what happened to happen, that they are responsible for what happened to the victim. So because it takes so long for them to get that awareness, it's important to assess their empathy for others in their lives before the offense as the basis for determining where they are morally. Moral development affects offenses because many times teenagers are righting a wrong in their involvement in an offense, and because they are under stress, are not making decisions that they otherwise would have based on what they know to be the right thing to do. In police questioning, their moral development affects them partly because many believe that it's morally wrong to snitch, and the majority of juvenile offenses are done with other juveniles, and because most teenagers, as I said, are in shock about the offense during police questioning, and their shame, which is an important part of where they are morally, will affect them as they respond to questions. Now that we've talked about immaturity as typical of all teenagers, I want to move on to the next section of the developmental framework, which is disabilities. We know that about half of the delinquents that we work with have disabilities. Some of them have been in special education, and others have not. But even those who have been in special education often have not had the services that would help them develop the compensatory skills for correctly assessed disabilities. So as a result, we see in many of the young people that we work with processing problems, which means that they don't digest information, communication that they hear or that they read in the same way as their peers who don't have disabilities. We often see expressive and receptive language problems in teenagers who have disabilities, but these impairments may not have been properly assessed, and services may not have been provided, and the young person may not be able to tell others, I have difficulty with the way that I take in information and express myself, and in order to do my best, I need this kind of assistance from adults. We also see executive function deficits in the teenagers we work with in the juvenile system. What this means is that their brains organize things very differently from their peers who don't have disabilities. And that extreme disorganization takes many forms. It's different from one teenager to another, but particularly affects sequencing in teenagers who have executive function problems. Now, often we see delinquents who have been diagnosed as ADHD because of their difficulty concentrating. But it's now become apparent that problems with attentiveness are also a symptom of trauma and may not be the result of ADHD at all, and are not going to be adequately treated by stimulant medication, which is the primary way that that children diagnosed with ADHD are responded to. Furthermore, children with true ADHD often have social skill deficits that have not been addressed in special education, and as a result, they have continuing peer difficulties even if their attentiveness has been improved as a result of medication. So disabilities affect teenagers in their offenses. Often they have not comprehended the intentions of others that they're with at the time. They describe things happening so fast during the offense, and that they were way behind in terms of understanding what was unfolding, and that in a sense kept them from fully grasping what was occurring and making any decisions based on information about what was happening at the time. We see them talk about their offenses in a very disorganized way. Their stories are often out of order, and that may be because of their executive function deficits. Even more than the typical teenager who, because of immature thinking, can't envision consequences. Young people who have the processing problems and impaired sequencing problems that I described are even more challenged to see what's occurring at the time and recognize the worst thing that could happen and act accordingly. Disabilities also will affect teenagers during their police questioning. Often they can't comprehend Miranda, whether it is presented orally or in a written form, and because many times they have been ashamed of being behind their peers in school, they've developed a tendency to not speak up, not ask for clarification and will often try to act as if they understand just as well as everyone else. During police questioning, they may present a very confused narrative for the reasons I described and have much greater difficulty explaining their actions because of their expressive language problems. Moving on now from disabilities to the last section of the developmental framework, we're going to talk about the effects of trauma. This is an area where there has been little attention to the impact of trauma on delinquent behavior, and where the recognition that most delinquents have a trauma history that influenced their behavior has been slow to come to everyone's attention. We see that teenagers in the delinquency system are affected by a range of trauma, not just physical abuse or sex abuse. Most of them have experienced significant losses that have been traumatic and may have been repeated. A surprisingly high number of them have parents who are deceased, parents who have been incarcerated for long periods of time. Many of them have come to the delinquency world from foster care and have spent years in foster care moving from one placement to another. So not only is there the trauma, the original abuse or neglect, which brought them into foster care in the first place, but there is the traumatic experience of multiple moves, which are even more losses. In addition, it's been more and more discovered through research that that what's called disrupted caregiving, particularly during a child's early years, results in children not developing a typical ability to manage their emotions. And this is thought to be part of what contributes to the reactivity of children in foster care because they have had various caregivers during the early years of their lives. Some of the characteristics of trauma that we see in delinquents are, first of all, an overreaction to perceived threat. Teenagers who have been victimized are always on the alert for more victimization. They are often called hypervigilant. And those who've been traumatized by domestic violence or community violence are particularly vigilant about someone harming them. Unfortunately, their high anxiety that comes from their repeated traumatic experiences leads them to perceive threat where it doesn't exist. For example, adults who they see as being aggressive toward them, who are not intending to be threatening, are misperceived by the traumatized teenager who then overreacts. And because their emotions are not well modulated, the traumatized teenager isn't able to calm themselves down, talk themselves through the recognition that they are being triggered by something that was victimizing in the past, but in fact is not posing a real threat to them in the present. Many of the teenagers that we work with who have experienced trauma have been depressed for years. It's often undiagnosed, but depression as well delays their emotional maturity, so that we see young people in delinquency who are chronologically 16 or 17, but emotionally resemble teenagers who are much younger. Many young people self-medicate as their way of managing their high anxiety and their depression that results from trauma. So from a young age, they have been using substances to numb their feelings and their bad memories. Trauma affects teenagers during their offenses in a variety of ways. If their victim was aggressive toward them and the teenager misinterpreted it, they will respond as if it's a repeat of past victimization. And it will look like a very exaggerated overreaction, which can only be understood in terms of what I've described as overreacting and the constant anxiety that they live with. Being unable to soothe themselves, this reaction looks very abnormal. And without treatment, they won't have learned to soothe themselves, something they should have learned when they were a much younger child, but did not. If they are high or drunk during the offense, of course that will lower their inhibitions. And because they tend to be very controlling, because of their high anxiety, traumatized teenagers don't respond well to changed circumstances, and that may be what it helps us to understand how they got into this surprising offense. Trauma also affects teenagers during police questioning. They can be quite scared during the questioning because of their reactivity to threat, even when it's not intended at all by the questioning officers. And if they are high and coming down during the questioning, that, of course, will affect the way that they respond. Moving on now from this brief review of immaturity, disabilities, and trauma, I want to talk about how we designed services in order to meet the needs of a teenager. Each teenager is going to have a unique combination of immaturity and trauma, and half of them of disabilities that may have affected them at the time of the offense. So what I've written in the services column of the developmental framework are examples of the services that would address immaturity, the services that would address disabilities, the services that would address trauma. But they're really only examples. What we have to do when we design rehabilitative services is to craft unique combinations of services for this young person because they have a unique collection of immaturity, disabilities, and trauma that are influencing their behavior. And we, as a result, have to do a lot of outside-the-box thinking. We have to come up with services that we might not have used previously in treating delinquents. And this is particularly true when we think about the intensity of services that we provide. And in the examples that I describe, I'll try to explain how important reconsidering the frequency or intensity of services is. This is why putting together rehabilitative services in a team is especially crucial, because everyone will assist others on the team in crafting unique service combinations and in thinking creatively about what might really address what's going on with this young person. And when we bring together a team, it's really important that the young person isn't just sitting in a seat at the table, but is participating actively in recognizing what's behind their behavior so that they are committed to the services that will address their characteristics. So to give examples of how we would design rehabilitative services for each young person in a different way, I've got two examples to talk about briefly. One is Sophia, who's a 16-year-old charged with assault, facing a decline hearing. She is a teenager with a long child welfare history. She was sexually abused, removed by Child Protective Services, and placed in one foster home after another as she was growing up. Finally, she was placed in a pre-adoptive home where she lived for 2 years. But her behavior, marijuana use, school problems in middle school, and difficulties at home were unfortunately not addressed with trauma treatment. So she didn't recover from the trauma of the sexual abuse, let alone then the trauma of repeated losses as she moved from one home to another. And sadly, finally her behaviors resulted in her pre-adoptive home saying that they couldn't go through with the adoption. This was devastating for her and led to her being in residential treatment and also hospitalized for a suicide attempt. She ended up being placed by child welfare in a group home and became involved in some street activities, and in that context was raped, leading to another residential treatment placement shortly before she turned 16. She still had the reactivity that I described in a teenager with untreated trauma, even though she's been in outpatient counseling, she's been in 2 residential treatment centers, and she's been hospitalized. She still has not had the treatment necessary to recover from trauma. So a staff person at the residential treatment center was restraining her, using a proper restraint, and she viewed it as a threat and overreacted and pushed the staff person, leading to her arrest for an assault and coming into the delinquency system. Given this history, we can see that our focus in designing rehabilitative services for Sophia is going to be to make sure that she recovers from trauma. But in addition, we also see that her behavior is influenced by her immaturity, which we would expect with any 16-year-old. So how do we go about designing an individual combination of services for her? Well, first, we've got to make sure that she has high-quality trauma treatment. And what this means is that she develops her own trauma history. She learns how the trauma of the past is influencing her everyday behavior in the present, and she learns how to separate the two. She learns what her triggers are and how to calm herself when she is feeling anxious because of triggers that remind her of the past. And in the process of doing this learning, she develops a trusting relationship that itself will be therapeutic for her. Secondly, in the area of immaturity, we have to make sure that Sophia has adequate support for developing a positive identity. She has felt rejected her whole life. So even though she's bright and doesn't have disabilities, she's not been successful enough at school to see herself as a school success or to have any future goals. And she has not excelled at anything else. She sees herself as a problem to everyone rather than as someone with talent. And so this is a true service. It's not enough to have her have some kind of mentoring or have opportunities for school success or athletic success. This is itself an important rehabilitative service that focuses on Sophia developing a positive identity that is stable. And also in the immaturity area, she needs to learn to think before she acts, which is, in addition to the trauma work she'll do about calming herself down, is developing a mature thought process where she can see the risks of choices that she makes, choices in peers, choices in street activities, choices about school, and it improves in her ability to evaluate her options and improves in her ability to communicate with others how she's making decisions. Moving on to Markel, a very different young person from Sophia, arrested at 14 for riding in a stolen car. We see that Markel has been raised by his grandmother because his mother has been incarcerated for much of his life, and his father has been uninvolved in his life. He lives in public housing in a high-crime neighborhood where there is a lot of gang activity and exposure to daily violence. He's been in special education since 3rd grade. but he continues to struggle and only reads at the 5th grade level at 14, making it impossible for him to participate in middle or high school level work. So he is more and more embarrassed by the challenges that he has being in the classroom and doing his work, and is begun to be alienated from school. And this lack of connection to school not only closes out a lot academically, but it's been recognized that a positive relationship with a teacher or another adult in school is a key ingredient to successful maturing in adolescence. Markel has, in the past, been involved in a Boys and Girls Club where he was recognized as a good athlete. But because he has school difficulties, he's never been involved in a school team. In this offense, he was offered a ride by his friends, and he got in the car, glad to have a ride home, not thinking about the fact that his friend wasn't old enough to have a driver's license, and he'd never seen him driving that car. But because of immaturity, he would be unable to ask his friend to pull over and let him out. So when we're thinking about what are the services that we're going to design for rehabilitation for Markel, our emphasis, of course, is going to be on immaturity, but he also has disabilities that appear to be influential in his thinking and having not been successfully addressed in his years in special education. And he has some trauma history also. So in designing services for Markel, first and foremost in the immaturity area, we know that he needs to learn how to choose positive peers, and how he needs to learn to stand up to peer pressure. Both very difficult for any teenager, and actually requiring instruction. So this isn't something that can just be expected to develop as a condition of probation, for example, but requires an instructional situation where he can practice how to be less influenced by peers. Secondly, Markel needs a great deal more supervision by adults. Some of that he would get if he was more actively involved in school, or if he was connected now to a community organization where there were adults that were protective. But his grandmother hasn't been exercising adequate supervision and providing the guidance that he needs. So another service that's important is to assist his grandmother in learning how to provide the kind of guidance and supervision that Markel requires. And that's not going to happen automatically just as a result of his arrest. Like Sophia, Markel also needs active support for a positive identity. He hasn't excelled at school, and he's had very limited athletic opportunities. So this is a service, as I said, to not just open the opportunities for him, but to support him so that he is successful, since it's success that forms the core of a stable, positive identity. Furthermore, Markel needs different, more effective special education services. And even though he is in special education, a reassessment and a recognition that all the services that he's been provided have not adequately given him the reading skills and the ability to compensate for whatever the particular disabilities are that make it so difficult for him to read. Lastly, he too needs trauma treatment, addressing the losses that he's experienced in his life so that he doesn't feel rejected because of the absence of his parents. So he doesn't feel that he is a bad person, which is how children think about such significant losses. And to help him not feel that he ought to follow in the footsteps of his parents. I want to stress that we can expect that Markel and Sophia's behaviors that have gotten them arrested are going to continue because of their immaturity, trauma histories, and in Markel's case, disabilities, unless those are addressed with effective services. The behaviors won't go away by themselves because they're driven by immaturity, disabilities, and trauma. The services that I've described for Markel and for Sophia, those individualized combination of services that fit who they are what we would first try to figure out when we're coming up with a package of the right services. And then at that point, we can talk through what's the location that the services are going to be delivered. So both packages of services for Markel and Sophia could be delivered in a variety of places, in a residential treatment or possibly in a delinquency facility for Sophia, but also possibly in the community in a treatment foster care situation. Likewise, for Markel, this collection of services could be delivered in the community should he be on probation. So let me stop there and hear some questions that have come up during this presentation. And as you heard at the beginning of the webinar, I'll stay on and respond to these questions after 3 o'clock.
Thanks, Marty. This is Katrine from OPD again. We do have some excellent questions that have come in so far, and we'd certainly encourage anyone else who has more questions, go ahead and type those in the questions/comments box. Just make sure to hit enter so we can see it. But the first question that came in early on, Marty, was what do you think of the adverse child experience findings and scale?
Well, this would take a long time to respond to. It's not a simple thumbs up or thumbs down. I think there are a variety of ways of assessing the impact of trauma on a teenager. I don't think that it's going to be adequate to hear the trauma history only from the teenager, and I don't think that it's that many teenagers will be open about the trauma symptoms that they have because of their not being aware of the connection between past trauma and their current behavior. So it takes more than an inventory to be able to give us an idea of the effects of trauma on a teenager.
All right. Let me go to the next one then, which is a two-part question for you. How do you address making sure that your client gets proper services when, number one, as a defense attorney, you're limited by what your client wants, and number two, you're limited by the few services that are offered by your local court and your local probation department.
Okay, well, let's talk about the second one quickly first. What we are used to being offered to delinquents is a much narrower range of services than is offered to kids who aren't delinquents and whose parents arrange for services, not all of which require the finances of that non-delinquent families often have. So we get limited to one mentoring program, one tutoring program, one counselor, and yet in our communities there are far more resources that could be individualized for this young person. I'm often asked the question, how do I arrange trauma treatment? We don't have that in our community. And that's simply not true. There are, even in smaller communities, clinicians who are providing trauma treatment to children and adolescents. And these are very successful treatments. They're just not the single provider that that the court may have used in the past. And similarly, the mentoring program or the tutoring program, the one program that's been utilized for delinquents, may not have the intensity necessary to assist, as I described it, with Markel or with Sophia in helping them develop their positive identity. They require more intensity, not just a once-a-month contact with a mentor. But those services can be arranged. It does take extra work. There's no question about that. Addressing the first part of your question, I agree that many teenagers have said, I don't want counseling, I'm not crazy, or I don't want a mentor in my life. And that's why it's so important for them to be involved, not just at the end when there's a disposition and they're going to be given a package of services. They're going to be given a list of services or things they have to comply with. It's really important that they not view services and supports as compliance, but instead that they participate right from the beginning with any assessment that's done, any use of this developmental framework, either by yourself as a defender, or by a probation officer, or by others involved in the young person's life after their arrest, who could apply this developmental framework and reveal to the teenager what they think are the contributors in the teenager's life to their delinquent offenses. And when that's shared, whether you have an expert who does a developmental assessment and pulls together the historical information and interview information on the teenager's immaturity, disabilities, and trauma, or whether you yourself are doing it. Once a teenager walks through it with someone, they go from there's nothing wrong with me, I don't want anything, I just want to be out of the delinquency system, to, yes, that really is what is going on with me. and they're recognizing that, which is not going to happen instantly, of course. It's not going to happen in one meeting where the adults in their life come together. It does take a lot of work to support the teenager to being able to have the self-awareness so that what was on the slides for Markel and Sophia is something they could say about themselves. And at that point, then they're participating in the design of the services that specifically match their characteristics.
All right. Thank you, Marty. We have more coming in. Those are just great. First of all, here's a question specifically about trauma treatment. How do you recommend finding trauma treatment? Well, there are a variety of ways to do it. If you live in a community that has a children's hospital, that can be a place where you know traumatized children are going for interviews and referrals to treatment. You can also seek out the state association for psychology, social work, and other clinicians, and get referrals from the state association for your area. So you're looking for someone who could have any number of clinical credentials, who has been trained in an evidence-based approach to trauma treatment, which is very common now among licensed clinicians. They may be accustomed to serving primarily insurance patients, but many of them will have a sliding scale. Many of them will be serving Medicaid-eligible children, which Sophia would be if she is not in a delinquency facility, a secure delinquency facility. She would continue to have Medicaid, for example. And so, again, you're not asking an individual trauma therapist to serve a large group of delinquents with your inquiry. You're asking them to provide treatment for one young person using their sliding scale or using Medicaid, assuming that their parent is unable or the system doesn't have other ways to pay for those services. For kids who are in facilities, whether residential or group care or in a delinquency facility, there will be clinicians working in those facilities, and there it's important to advocate that the so-called treatment plan for the young person is not behavior-driven, not stop this behavior, but instead is a trauma-responsive plan that sees recovery from trauma as the primary rehabilitative work of the facility. And that isn't true for a lot of delinquency facilities right now, but it's not going to become true if we aren't making clearer and clearer requests for that in the dispositional packages that we design and the work that we do in advance with a residential facility. All right. Marty, I've got a hypothetical for you. Prosecutor says that rehabilitation has to start with being held accountable, or else kids are going to think that they can get away with things. How would you deal with that dynamic where some of these kids have not ever been held accountable before?
Well, it all depends on how you define accountability, of course. I mean, a teenager who is immature and sees their actions as accidental or impulsive isn't going to talk in a way about their offense that sounds like they think they ought to be held accountable. But that's going to be true of the teenager that I described who's typical, who goes to their exam poorly prepared and stayed up all night. They're only begrudgingly going to acknowledge when their parent says, why did you get a poor grade on this exam? They're not going to pop up and say, oh, I take full responsibility for it. I stayed up all night texting with my best friend, and I really wasn't prepared. They're going to grumble about how the test wasn't fair and put the blame elsewhere. That's just typical of teenagers. So any good delinquency service that actively addresses immaturity is going to help a teenager be able to see for everything you do, you made a choice. And for everything you do, you had the opportunity to look at the pros and cons. And when you make the choices that you make, if it turns out to be a poor choice, then it's your responsibility that you made that poor choice. Every teenager during their adolescence gradually develops that internal voice that walks them through that process. But we don't expect it to be there in a teenager, especially an unusually immature teenager, when they're 15, 16, or even 17. It has to be taught. And so, yes, to feel accountable means that a teenager has to change their thinking. But we don't expect that their thinking changes without careful, direct adult assistance that's designed for helping them feel responsible, see their responsibility for every decision that they make and its consequences. Not just the big one that got them to this offense, but this learning really occurs much better in terms of every day holding themselves accountable and having adult guidance in doing that. And that occurs in community-based settings where that's the purpose of them, as well as in residential settings where that's the purpose. There's little learning from punishment itself if you're wanting to change the thought process of being responsible for one's own behavior, which gradually develops, can be speeded up with this kind of extra support and instruction that I'm describing. And I don't think we can write off this young person being able to be rehabilitated by the belief that right now, soon after the offense, he or she is not saying, I'm fully accountable for what happened. That will take rehabilitative work for them to get there. So our job is to make sure that the services necessary for learning how to think that way are provided.
Oh, let me also just add on to that, Marty. This is all being recorded, and this training is going to be put onto the OPD website. So certainly if anyone has other colleagues within their systems who haven't had this kind of training before, we're hoping that this could be a resource you can share. A couple more quicker questions maybe. First of all, does the use of marijuana on the adolescent brain drastically increase immature thinking?
Oh, that's a That's a good one. I don't know. Certainly there is some research about impulsivity and some research about the questions about whether marijuana reduces anxiety. But I don't know a definitive answer. Certainly it's true that using marijuana, and particularly daily use of marijuana, is likely to be done in a peer group. And so we'd have to think about this question in the context of the immaturity findings, that it is typical of teenagers to be much more peer influenced than adults. So if they are using substances with peers, they are being influenced not only by the chemical, but also by the fact that they're with peers who are being influenced by a chemical, and that their offense is likely to be in the context of wanting to belong, wanting acceptance, going along with others. And I don't know how you could tease those things apart. But I'm not a researcher, so I hope that you'll continue to look at any studies that you can find that would help in answering that question. Certainly, because of the amount of trauma that we see in the delinquency population, daily use of marijuana as a self-medicating approach to anxiety and depression is very common. But for sure how that influences immature thinking, I would guess, is unknown.
Okay. One last question here, unless any more pop in, and that is, I've heard that it's at approximately age 25 that the brain develops a more mature thinking. Is that your opinion?
Well, what you're talking about is that the anatomy of the brain continues to progress over the course of not just the teen years, but into the early 20s, so that there is less and less reliance on the amygdala, the emotion center of the brain, and much more efficiency in the frontal cortex, which is the location of adult decision-making and good judgment. So this does continue to occur past the age of 18 with different teenagers' brains maturing somewhat, developing somewhat differently from each other. The connection between an individual's brain development and their decision-making isn't a simple one for us to describe. So their brain is developing into their 20s, and their thinking is maturing along with brain development. But there are other things that are impacting on their decision-making. So from my point of view, we can expect the characteristics of immaturity in anyone who's under 18. And it would be surprising to have even a 17-and-a-half-year-old who didn't have some of those characteristics of immaturity. Of course, many teenagers are immature after the age of 18, and of course, their brains are still developing.
All right. Well, I think we're going to tie things up there. That seems to be the rest of the questions for right now. So thank you, everybody, for sending those in. I want to thank you all very much for being here today for this webinar. In the website box there on your screen, there is actually a link to a class evaluation. If you don't mind taking just a couple minutes to answer, there's just a small handful of questions there. We really do welcome your feedback. Also, for anyone who's looking for CLE or CJE credit here within Washington State, don't forget to download that document, follow the instructions so we can get you the credit. And then also next week I will follow up with an email sending everybody a link to this recording. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and we hope you all have a great weekend.
Thanks, Katrine. Thanks, Marty.
Thanks, George.